Thanks a lot for this invitation, for having me here. So, as Mireia mentioned, my name is Gall. I'm director at KA, and I'm going to talk to you about a more, let's say, European perspective, a sort of comparative approach to how culture contributes to city making, especially in metropolitan areas, and what are the different models out there. Well, it doesn't seem to be. Bit of a technical issue, but it should be fine. Or I can go to the computer if it's easier. Okay, yeah, that works as well. So it's a sort of half digital, half physical exercise here. A few words on who we are at KA. So we exist since 1999, and we are based in Brussels. So we are a consultancy and research center specialized in culture, creative industries, and sports. We are also active in China since 2012, and but our core focus remains Europe, and we are active across all European territories. We do different things, ranging from really strategic consultancy to public-private bodies, including cities, of course, to European projects and research and studies. So, just to give you a quick overview of where we are active, so pretty much, well, everywhere in Europe. And as Mireia mentioned, what I'm going to talk to you about also stems from the experience of a project called Culture for Cities and Regions that we carried out together with Eurocities. And that project enabled us to work with 150 cities and regions to look at their cultural policies, what they did for culture, creative industries, urban regeneration, and social cohesion especially. In fact, Barcelona was also involved, and we did a study visit to look at the Art Factories program here in Barcelona, so just so you know. And we also had a dedicated coaching scheme where we helped cities in rethinking their cultural policies all over Europe. Now, what are we going to talk about today, more specifically? I have listed a couple of questions. I'm not going to kind of really give a definite answers to all of them, but these are, I think, important questions to think in the sort of metropolitan perspective on culture and creativity. The first thing, when you look at the metropolitan area, is the sort of flows across the different centers of this metropolis. And the big question here is, how does arts and culture contribute to citizens' intra-metropolitan mobility? That's one of the first questions that we are going to ask ourselves. Can arts and culture actually move people in a physical way? Then the second big question is to move from a simple mobility question and shift towards a place-making question. How does arts and culture contribute to shape not only the way citizens use the metropolis, but the way the arts and culture build the metropolitan area for its citizens? So that's the place-making question, and that's the second question, very important. Then I'm going to go more into the comparative perspective. What are the current models? What are other cities, regions, metropolitan areas doing to develop some polycentric models for culture and creative industries? And then we'll sort of move into the key challenges, and then I'll also look into some tips, advices that I can give from an external perspective here. So let's move with the first chapter, which is the role of arts and culture and creativity in cities today. So first, Oops, there you go. Oh, power problem. So the first thing I'd like to mention is that we take a very broad view on what arts and culture are and what they can do for a city. This is going to be shown in the next slide, but what we will see, what we see is that they have a very cross-cutting nature. This was discussed in the previous session as well. And and they contribute, in fact, they feed in many other policy areas of a city and the metropolis. So they can feed into the attractiveness of any given city, and they can contribute sort of communication, branding. You have famous examples of that, like, for example, Amsterdam, the whole I Amsterdam branding. They can also contribute to shaping education, new urban developments. Culture and urban regeneration is something that we are witnessing in just so many cities in Europe. For example, the Liverpool example is a good one, for example, where they use the European Capital of Culture to redynamize the whole historic center of the city. But you also have some other examples discussed and sometimes a bit controversial, like the Bilbao effect with the Guggenheim Museum. But you have a lot of examples across Europe that show the power of culture and creative industries to really boost a whole district or in a metropolitan area. And of course, you have tourism, creative spillovers across different industries. So more the sort of commercial and economic development side of culture and creative industries. And in fact, I'm looking at my slides, but sometimes I feel that I could just look at that wall here, because it's not so far away from what I'm saying here. So I think that this perspective is something that you also captured quite well here. So if we can, yeah, next time. So then, let's look at the basic question: can arts and culture move people? So I thought, well, let's look at some quick facts. So this is from a broad perspective. Can arts and culture contribute to making people move? Well, if you look at the sheer culture and tourism perspective, it's 40% of people that move, travel for cultural purposes. So, well, that tends to be a yes. Then we look into, well, some institutions, cultural places in Barcelona. Well, it's a bit small, but if you look at the right side of the slide, what you can see is that all these most visited places in Barcelona can be considered as cultural spaces. I mean, you can have some distinctions, for example, on the aquarium and so on, but there are museums, cultural institutions, heritage places, and all of them have visitors which total more than 1 million people per year. 4 million for the Sagrada Familia, for example. 4.5 million. So, well, arts and culture do seem to move quite a lot of people. For an example from a festival perspective as well is the Sonar Festival as well, which has an increasing audience every year. But then the big question as well, when you look at these big figures, is for whom are these sort of attractions designed for? Is it for people in the metropolitan area of Barcelona? Is it for tourists? Who is sort of being moved by these cultural aspects? So there is a question here, which is, arts and culture is certainly attractive. But then, who benefits from that? So there is a question between attractiveness of cultural and creative places and the ownership question. To whom does these cultural spaces belong to, who goes there, who actually uses them. And that's a question that you can ask yourself for the center of Barcelona, which probably benefits also a lot to tourists, but also from the other cities in the metropolitan area. Do the people from Barcelona itself go there, or is it more designed for local citizens? So there is a kind of ownership and purpose question here. So let's look at this metropolitan areas question. Let's shift from this whole mobility, attractiveness question to real place-making question. So I'd like to say a few words about one very important category of people which have not really been discussed so far. And these are the cultural workers, the people, the artists, the people working in the creative industries. This is also a very broad definition. It's basically everyone related to the cultural and creative sectors. And that is a very important question when we talk about ownership, because even if you look at it from a metropolitan perspective, ultimately the one that will actually do the work are those cultural workers. And the ownership question is important also for them. To what extent are they allowed to sort of shape the policies, the programs, the artistic activities that have a metropolitan dimension? And this is very important as well, because cultural workers are in many ways innovating placemaking. They want to take a role in the city. They want to interact with citizens. They want their work to be seen, to be engaged with, and they want it to be engaged with by a diversity of audiences. Thank you. Diversity of audiences and citizens. They are gradually getting involved in social innovation projects, and I'm pretty sure that here at City Lab you have lots of these so-called creative cultural workers. So there is a trend there as well that we have to acknowledge and take on board when we design policies and programs for the cultural and creative sectors. And I would like to say with the cultural and creative sectors. Damn it. I had hoped, but okay. Yeah. Let's look more broadly at what contributes to placemaking, to cultural and creative placemaking. These are the sort of cultural and creative resources that are present in any cities. And I say any city for a purpose here, because of course, if you look at Barcelona, well, you've got a wealth of all of this, basically. But if you look at the smaller cities across the metropolitan area, probably they also have quite a few strong assets in there. As long as you take a very broad perspective, every territory has some strong assets they can play with. It's just very important to be aware of what you have and what you don't have, and to play to your strengths. So when you look at sort of placemaking perspective at metropolitan level, it might be that you have to play with one or the other of these different components, but not all of them necessarily. Oh, it works now. So I'm not going to look more specifically into some examples here. And let me check the time. Yeah. And if I have some time at the end of the presentation, I'll add more examples as well. But I'm looking at three cities, metropolises, in fact, today. I've picked them up because of their more or less similar sizes to Barcelona. I mean, it's always difficult to find the exact size, but also the sort of different management models, governance models that are out there, and that might correspond to your specific situation. Okay, let's start with the big one. So London. Well, London is a very interesting city in many ways. It's a very interesting example as well because in many ways London is a so-called world city. But still, when I sort of research all their cultural policy documents and all their all the initiatives that they are doing at the moment, well, a lot of that is actually focusing to their borough development. Borough are they're not exactly municipalities, but that's the closest thing that can, sorry? District. Yeah, it's a district, exactly. And it's part of the Greater London area, but they are managed also, they have independent, let's say, administration and political units that manage the different boroughs. So there is a close similarity between Greater London and Barcelona metropolitan area in some ways. So let's look at, okay, this paradoxical sort of world city versus polycentric development approach. If you look at the main, let's say, attractions of London, well, it's basically the cultural vibrancy of London as a city, as a metropolis. Well, first, it's the sort of music scene in London. More than 17,000 music performances, okay. The world's most popular music venue, so it's a very dynamic music city. Very importantly, it is culture is actually very important for London citizens as well. So they estimate that 84% of people feel that a vibrant cultural life is important in the city. So it's valued. That's also very important. Then you've got leading museums, leading festivals as well. You name it. I mean, it's a world city with a sort of world-class cultural vibrancy and cultural offering. But then, if you look at the right side, of course, I didn't include all the sort of policy actions that London is currently developing, but wanted to look at a couple of initiatives here. The first one is the Borough of Culture competition, which is inspired by the UK City of Culture competition and also the European Capital of Culture competition. It's basically at Greater London scale. They are doing the same sort of competition for boroughs to be a borough of culture. So they selected one for 2019 and 2020 with earmarked funding for cultural activities that has a sort of localness turn to it. So sort of highlighting the local strengths, local artists, local values in a way, local communities in the different boroughs. That's interesting as well. Then you look at the sort of flagship initiatives. Flagship could be on the left column or on the right column, but here the new Museum of London, I put it in the right because first, because it's a new policy, and second, because it also has a sort of deconcentration element to it. This new Museum of London is a £70 million investment to built in the outer district of London. I don't remember the name now, but I can't find it. So it's a sort of deconcentration through not only highlighting what's being done in some local areas, but also by sort of shifting away from the center some of the key cultural institutions of the city. It still has a leadership role as well, which is to sort of strengthen, build capacity across other cultural and creative institutions in the city. That's also an interesting model. So the museum not only sort of shifts away from the center, but also spills over to other cultural institutions. Oh, it works. Yeah. So What's very important as well is that London is not only working for a cultural policy perspective, it's also working with the creative industries perspective. And that's something very important that was already mentioned a couple of times in the first panel discussion that we had. So if you look at the creative enterprises, the zones, this is very interesting because London is known as a sort of creative industry capital, and it's always been a center for creative talent to go there and set up a business. Here, the zones are also located in the outer boroughs of the city. And there is, again, earmarked funding to actually develop those specific zones across the city, across the metropolis. So I've listed a bit the different types of actions that they support, but it's quite comprehensive, and it's not particularly groundbreaking. It's the type of support schemes that you can find somewhere else. The novelty is rather that you sort of empower local communities to develop a real creative business support scheme in a deconcentrated way. So you have 10 boroughs which are currently implementing those projects. And very importantly as well, it's also, I'm not sure if you know the model of community land trust, but it's basic. They applied that model to the cultural and creative sectors, which is basically a sort of access to the real estate market for with a sort of social innovation component where people sort of pull together the resources, and some houses or spaces are made available at a cheaper price for people doing that. Well, anyway, Creative Land Trust is also combined with this creative enterprise zones. So it's not only a sort of business support program, it's also affordable workspaces, cultural spaces, creative spaces, to develop the cultural and creative sectors in those boroughs. So it's a sort of combination of cultural policy, real estate policy and urban planning, and creative industries and economic policy. So it's a sort of combination of different levels of policy. So I could talk for ages about London, but just some quick food for thought on what I just briefly presented. The whole Greater London is quite specific because you've got a very strongly integrated metropolitan area with clear competencies for City of London and Greater London and the boroughs. So that's quite specific. Also, there is a strong real estate pressure in London, and probably here in Barcelona you have the same as well, which sort of drives many inhabitants, many citizens outwards of the sort of city center, well, traditional city center. So you've got also this pressure to actually dynamize some new neighborhoods that were before in the outskirts of the city. Also, well, there is a couple of huge redevelopment of the city which are taking place, which have taken place and which are still taking place, like the redevelopment of the whole area around the London 2012 Games with a sort of sustainability plan for this large-scale urban renewal approach. And finally, there are two very important points to mention. Why is this working? The first part is because there is a strong consultation and participation model which is at place here through local advisory boards, for example, for the enterprise zones, but also through an advisory board for cultural and creative industries at Greater London level. So there are some spaces for discussion, spaces for consultation that are set up as well. And also there is a very important question, is at policy level, there's very strong integration between cultural policy, creative industries policy, and art support. So these questions are all tied together. When you look at the cultural strategy, it's also a creative industry strategy. So there is no distinction between, let's say, the culture for social cohesion, culture for art's sake, as we say, and culture for economic development purposes. All that are integrated in a single strategy. And that's something which is quite important. Oh. Sorry. Now let's look at Helsinki and Espoo, which is a very, very different model, but also a very interesting one. I'm not going to go too much into the details on that one because I'm going to focus on some very specific aspects. But just to give you a bit of background on these two cities, well, you probably know Helsinki, which is the capital of Finland. Espoo is the second city in Finland, and it's basically right next to Helsinki. It's a conurbation, really. But still, it's a separate city, but they work in a sort of metropolitan way as well, because it's so close from one another. And that's an interesting model, because it is not formalized as well. It's a metropolis that has no metropolitan authority in a way. So let's look at very briefly at some of the sort of policy tools that they use to develop a sort of polycentric approach between the two cities. I'm going to talk especially of one thing, which is the sort of embedding culture, arts and culture in schools, because this is something that they are doing a lot in Finland, and that's also an interesting model to look at from a metropolitan perspective. The reason for that is that schools and educational institutions are probably the type of institutions that have the most widespread net across any metropolitan areas. I don't know in Cornelia, but probably you have many schools across all districts of the city. Same in Barcelona, same in other cities of the metropolis. So schools are everywhere for obvious reasons. And here, what they do through the CULPS program is to incentivize the cooperation between schools and educational institutions and cultural places. It's basically to develop curricula in cultural spaces. It can be museums, it can be a place like City Lab here, it can be any very different places, but it's basically a small grant to support education outside of schools. And that's an interesting model because it's a way to first ensure that children get to know actually all these cultural spaces across the city, and then take also the parents there. So there is a sort of empowering cultural institutions through having them work in cooperation with schools. Very briefly, a couple of points to explain why this is working. The grants are very flexible. It can be from 5,000 euros to 5 million euros for very large projects. Also, the city itself is playing a huge role of facilitation between the schools and the cultural spaces. So it's not like they have to do all the work themselves, find the right ways to cooperate. So there is a kind of brokering role here by the public authority, which is very important. Let's look at also another example, which is a sort of co-design approach. It might be very similar to what you're doing here in City Lab. It's called Operation Pulse, and the principle is very simple. It's basically, it's led by youth centers, and the purpose is basically to say, well, some services are moving back towards the center of the cities. Lots of social services and also lots of cultural services. So the idea is to say, well, the activities that we normally should be able to do in our district are not there anymore, so we are going to develop them ourselves. So it's a sort of program to co-design cultural, creative activities in any given neighborhood through centers for young people. So it's a sort of rethinking a bit the approach as well to cultural activities and entrusting them to non-cultural operators with the support, of course, of cultural institutions. That's an interesting model as well. It needs to be evaluated and it needs to be really thought through to see if it's appropriate, but I just wanted to pitch the example in case this makes sense in your particular context. Okay, let's go back to the UK. We like the country. So I just wanted to look at Birmingham because that's a very specific example. It's a bit smaller. It's a bit less of sort of large metropolitan areas. It's half the size of the one in Barcelona. Thanks. Yeah, perhaps I'll move there. So Birmingham is interesting. They have identified their sort of priority neighborhoods in the metropolis. Those priority neighborhoods are not related to culture. They are related to a set of indicators, including social indicators, economic indicators, and they are the sort of 5% of the population that is the worst in the metropolitan area. But that means that they became a priority for policy actions. They identified 31 of them, and I'm going to move there. Sorry. Is it working? Is it working? No. Okay, very well. I'm moving back. Up. It's my sports side of KEA taking over. Let's look at Birmingham. So they identified priority neighborhoods, and then they developed, and then they also have, of course, a cultural policy, which is sort of, and the Culture Commissioning Service is the sort of implementing arm of their cultural policy. So it basically allocates the grants and all support to cultural and creative activities in the city. It's a messy slide, but there are two things that I want you to have a look at. The first thing is at the bottom, the Arts Champion Program, because this is something I'm going to talk about very soon. And also, on the left side, the local arts development, which has a strong community focus, as you can see on the bottom left, connecting communities. So these are two programs that are clearly focusing on those priority neighborhoods that I mentioned earlier. And what they do is, for connecting communities, is to develop sort of locally rooted cultural and creative activities. And on the other hand, so that's a sort of more local, homegrown cultural policy and program, sorry. And on the other hand, the Arts Champion Program is a very interesting model of sort of cultural deconcentration. It's basically conditioning part of the funding going to the big city center museums, and Birmingham has a lot of them. And the condition part of this funding to actually doing activities in those priority neighborhoods. And that led to, of course, the Arts Champion Program, but also broader, a broader, let's say, cultural vision, I would call it. It's called Culture on Our Doorstep, so which is a sort of the cornerstone of Birmingham current cultural policy. So it's linking the first cultural communities program that I mentioned, which is co-designing their own cultural provision in a wide range of places, increasing their relevance and immediacy to the different communities. So it's basically developing that really in the neighborhoods. The second one is to set up and work with local arts fora. So here again, we see this sort of advisory board, local partnership component that is the vehicle to develop these co-design activities. Okay, I think we can skip to the next slide. Oh, sometimes it actually works. So, yeah. And this is also where the Arts Champion program pitches in, because basically the culture on our doorstep is about having culture at your doorstep as you are developing it yourself, but also having the central cultural institutions going through to these neighborhoods to take part in these co-design activities. What it means in practice, it means that they make available their staff, so working time, their expertise as well in in managing cultural programming and cultural activities. And also they make available some small financial resources to sort of jumpstart the first cultural programming and cultural activities. In a way, it might be similar to the dance festival that you experimented with this year. So the very interesting thing about Birmingham is that they really made use of their cultural resources, the big city center museum, to actually involve them in community work in other neighborhoods. So it means that the museums are sort of wider than the museum space itself. They are sort of shaping part of the entire metropolitan area. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind. It's not because a museum is located in a specific place that it cannot act in other places. Museums are not, and cultural spaces, creative spaces in general, are not bound by their walls in any way. That's a very important thing to consider, and that's why I wanted to mention this Arts Champion program. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Just a very quick, more in-depth look into this whole co-design approach. Well, there are. I think it's important to discuss that because this is something that you can do in any given city. It's more an approach than a sort of locally rooted activity or anything. So the basic principles are to work with local communities, to research the needs, to identify the needs. So that's the first step, the whole research with residents, but also to start thinking of ideas of cultural activities, cultural programming, what is needed in that specific area, and what can be done with them and for them. So this also involves the artistic team, either directly the artist or the curator or the creative professionals. So they sort of jointly develop an artistic, cultural proposal, which is then delivered with them, and it's then evaluated, tested, prototyped, and reviewed to be sort of carried out in a better way over the years. So it's a sort of simple but very cooperative, very participative process, and I think that you have the people here that can help you as well to develop this kind of approach, because I think City Lab is exactly doing that in different fields. So what it means here is that here the sort of skill set that was required for the co-design approach was provided also partly from the cultural side, but also through professional designers. So the idea here is, okay, well, the citizens are quite easy to identify. They're already in the living there. Of course, you need to catch the interested ones, but the kind of skill set that you need to develop this co-design approach is quite important. First, sort of design thinking approach, and then on the other hand, also the cultural programming approach. Yep. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm more or less. How much time do I still have? Quarter, okay. 10 minutes, okay, perfect. So let's now move away from these practical examples, and there are many more examples out there. I didn't touch so much upon the sort of creative industries dimension because I thought we were more looking at the cultural policy perspective, but definitely I can also discuss that more in depth with you because that's probably my favorite topic, in fact. But I restrain myself. But I'd like to talk about some challenges that I've sort of identified in my work with different cities and regions across Europe, and then try to develop some tips, advice, and some tips, advice, and recommendations for the future. Well, just looked at, I was briefly looking at the main cultural attractions in Barcelona. I was trying to find a map of that. And this is, I think it comes from Barcelona Life or something. It's not necessarily very scientific, but still, it shows that, of course, there is a kind of strong concentration of landmark cultural resources. That's not a surprise. That's a challenge we all have to play with whenever we are working in a metropolitan area with a larger sort of city center. And this is Barcelona, but if you take London, it will be the same. If you take Paris, it will be even worse. So it's just a fact that we have to acknowledge and work with. But it means also that due to this concentration, there is a sort of balance to find between steering from this sort of larger center of powers, be they political, administrative, but also cultural and economic. When I talk about power figures, it can be a specific museum in the center of Barcelona which shapes sort of the cultural policy in the city and perhaps in the metropolis. So that's a sort of balance between steering with the expertise with the sort of more powerful players and enabling more bottom-up approaches growing in the different areas of the metropolis. That's a very important balance to find between sort of using the expertise that exists already and enabling new sort of innovative sometimes cultural activities, programming, cultural development to happen, basically. Something that was mentioned before in the previous panel already, it's a very common challenge. It's the difficulty to connect at political level, because in any metropolitan area you've got different political colors, you've got different, even in the same political parties, sometimes you've got different views of what culture means in the city. And sometimes also it's difficult to connect with larger cultural institutions, which have been there for a long time, which are playing a huge role in the city, and which don't necessarily see the purpose of sort of displacing their activities towards a more deconcentrated model. That's, for example, in Birmingham, it was a struggle at the beginning of the program to achieve the sort of arts champion program. A very important challenge, and I'm not sure to what extent it's the case here, is the sometimes very complex imbrication of levels of responsibility between metropolis, between cities, between districts, between sometimes at federal level as well, sometimes regional level. The cultural arts support, economic policy for creative industries, they might be in the hands of very different people at very different territorial levels. That's a classic example of whole cultural policy and economic policy acting at different levels. It's very often the case. And in fact, I wanted to use Brussels as an example for today's presentation, but couldn't find out who was responsible for culture and who was responsible for creative industries, so I didn't use it. Sometimes the complexity, Brussels is a very specific case, the complexity of the different levels plays a sort of barrier role also in developing a more integrated vision for culture, creative industries in a large urban space. More specifically on co-design approaches, because I think it's very relevant to what you are trying to do here. It's a long-term process. The actual delivery of it is not necessarily very long, but the process building up to a proper co-design approach can be very long. That includes especially to understand very well the local context of residents, what is their challenges, and that's a very micro-level perspective. It's really understanding a specific district, perhaps even a specific street or building. It implies as well that you develop a long-term sort of relationship with the residents that you wish to work with. You need to build trust with them over the long run. So a co-design approach cannot start with, this is what we want to do with you. It needs to be first a sort of approach, get to know each other. So there is a sort of long-term process needed, and importantly, it means that even if co-design is about working with people, that doesn't mean that there is no heavy management involved, because you need to develop that approach over the long run and work together for quite a long time period. So it's quite time consuming as well, especially for your staff. One very big challenge, and that applies at pretty much all levels, be it district, city, metropolis, region, national, European, worldwide, you name it. A very big challenge is to find the right interlocutor, because very often there is none. There is no sort of representative of the cultural and creative sectors that you can actually reach out to. The sectors are very badly organized usually. So it's very difficult to develop a proper metropolitan-wide approach with the while speaking to the right people, because it happens very often that there are no people like that. I don't know if it's the case in Barcelona, but there are very few federations of the cultural and creative sectors at city and regional level. So it means that you need to build that sort of capacity to represent a bit the cultural and creative players. You need to find the right individual players that can be, in a way, representative. It's a sort of really field work to identify the right people and to sort of set up the right partnership structure through a board, through a sort of platform for discussion, or a sort of, it can be also an advisory role in setting up policies and programs. There are different ways to do that, but the most important thing is first to find the right people, and that can be very challenging. So now it's almost the end of my presentation. I'm just going to look at some tips and advice and some policy approaches for what we are trying to achieve here. So, very importantly, what I found out in this project where we worked with 150 cities and regions, and considering also our experience at KA of working with national governments at EU level, the basic sort of most important finding is that cities is where innovation happens in terms of cultural policy making, cultural and creative policy making. So the sort of 21st century future forward-looking policy approaches, they're all happening at city level. That's very important to keep in mind. Now I'll just go specifically in what we are discussing here today and the sort of intra-metropolitan mobility of people through cultural activities, and also a sort of metropolitan-wide cultural and creative industries policy. Some quick tips and advice on that, and then more generally on what sort of policy advice I can give on city development through culture and creative industries. The first one, very important, often forgotten, a long-term strategy. That's very important. A sort of large planning process, a sort of long-term vision for what you want the metropolitan area to become over the long run. But long-term means that this vision needs to be flexible and it needs to be inclusive through partnerships. So it's about planning, but also involving. So those two are sort of pillars for a strong cultural and creative industries policy in any place. So partnerships and developments are not only through forcing the right places for discussion, review, agreement on cultural policies, but it's also about entrusting. It's also about entrusting cultural and creative institutions, players, companies, startups, in having open projects for cities, for metropolitan areas, because they can give also a new perspective on how to shape the city itself. And again, they are gradually doing it more and more all over Europe. That's a very important one. I talked about cultural resources at the beginning. One thing which is very important is that usually cultural resources, the immediate sort of suspects are very important. The largest cultural institutions, they play a very important role in a city. But sometimes you need to look at the smaller ones, especially the ones that are sort of active everywhere in the metropolitan area. So that can be, for example, cultural centers. Or depends on the countries, but in many countries you've got small cultural centers a bit everywhere in different cities. It can be libraries as well. And when I mean libraries, it's not only a place where you borrow a book and give it back afterwards. It's also very important in many places, and it's the case in Helsinki, it's the case in many Nordic countries. It's a sort of multimodal place where you have, of course, the access to knowledge dimension, which has always been there, but also the shaping new knowledge, discussion space, cooperative space. And in many ways, it's a sort of, they are becoming sort of social innovation labs. I'm not sure how feasible that is in Barcelona. I don't know the sort of status of libraries, but sometimes they can be very helpful and very interesting actors to work with and to further enhance their roles. One advice is as well to, when you sort of shift towards a polycentric approach, is to take some small steps first, prototyping and testing some approaches, for example, through a festival, through sort of non-permanent cultural programming and cultural activities. So not necessarily do the flagship approach like London is doing, putting a museums, which was in the city center, in the outskirts of the city. That doesn't work well usually. They did it because of different reasons, because it's a sort of momentum they built up. But that's not the sort of initial approach that I would advise. And similarly, I would strongly encourage the use of sort of small grants through open calls as well. It can be open calls that actually allow people to test and... Sorry, I'm moving too much. It's my sport hat. Using small grants to activate participation, activate structures that might not be aware that they can get involved in a sort of metropolitan project, but sort of launching small calls can actually make them aware of the potential there is and have them think and develop new approaches, innovative ones sometimes, to deliver on this sort of vision that I mentioned in the first point. So it's a sort of fishing for ideas proposal to use this small grant. Oops. And I'll conclude with that. More generally, that is not necessarily strongly linked to the topic we are discussing here today, but I think that very importantly, cities and regions and metropolitan areas have today to take the risk of cultural investment. It's not more risky than investing in other economic and social areas. When you look at creative industries, for example, just from an economic perspective, creative industries, businesses, they have a failure rate which is much lower than digital startups, for example. But we are still perceiving them as risky. And it's the same for cultural activities. It's seen as something risky to invest in or to give support to, because you're not sure of the return that you're going to get on that. Well, my take on that is, first, there is no guarantee in any policy-making area. Second, if you follow some of these steps, then the results have been noticed in more than 150 cities and regions in Europe. So that's a sort of guarantee you don't get in many other policy areas. And those sort of tips are, of course, the leadership of vision. I already discussed that before, but perhaps more importantly, to understand your own cultural resources. That's very important, to map them, to even do a full study on that if you need to, but to really pinpoint what are these sort of pockets of cultural assets that you have in your city or region. And it might be something that you're not even aware of at the moment, even if cities are understanding quite well today the sort of wide range of what culture and creativity is. Valuing your cultural workers is very important, because very often the downside of understanding culture and creative industries in a broad way is to think that, okay, culture plays a role in social cohesion, so let's have some sort of social-driven cultural activities. But that might also work in such a way that culture is instrumentalized. And that is very dangerous, because you lose the trust of cultural workers. So there is a sort of mutual understanding that you need to develop with cultural workers as well. Think innovation. What's innovation in culture, creative industries? What is sort of new ideas, new concepts that will shape tomorrow's society? That's very important to look at from a city perspective, especially in cities like Barcelona, which have a sort of global scale. We're not looking into technological innovation. We are looking into the use of it. We are looking into new content, new concepts, but we are looking into very intangible vision of innovation. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be supported. Build capacity and interlocutors to talk to. That's very important as well. I already covered it. The two points afterwards: encourage accidental encounters and linking pins. I'm going to cover them together. It's basically about encouraging networking, encouraging the fact that people that may never meet should actually meet. And it's about ensuring that sort of this mix, this mingling of different skill sets, different people, actually lead to this, to new, very innovative projects, very impactful ones. That means that this sort of accidents should be supported, because there is not necessarily places where these people meet. I mean, they don't meet during their work, they don't necessarily go to the same places afterwards. So how do you actually encourage that artists, cultural and creative industries meet with tech industries, for example? Well, this is usually done through networking events or also through places that connect. And City Lab is probably a very good example here. Places that connect very different skills and very different people. And the linking pins are people that facilitate these encounters. And very often they can be found in city administrations, they can be found in the management of some cultural spaces, creative spaces. So work with people who sort of understand both worlds as well to encourage this sort of networking and encounters, as I call them. And the last point is quite an obvious one for my consultant hat, which is to document the process, evaluate the impact of your actions, and rethink, redesign what you're doing frequently. Thank you very much, and I hope this will sort of trigger some discussions, and I think we need to go for the coffee break, but I'm available for any question you may have on this, and I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of the day, listening to you, and discussing with you as well. Thank you.